It sits on the edge of Brandon, Manitoba, where the city gives way to open prairie. Red brick, 4 stories, long symmetrical wings that extend from a central administration block, like arms stretched wide. The windows are tall and narrow. The roofline is punctuated by dormers that look out over what was once farmland, flat, open, reaching toward a horizon that goes on longer than seems possible. The building has the solid, settled look of something that knows it belongs here, that has always known it belongs here. Between 1891 and the latter decades of the 20th century, inside these walls, the province of Manitoba confined thousands of men and women under a system of classification that had more to do with who they were than with anything that was wrong with their minds. They came from farming communities and from reserves. They came from poverty and from the margins of a rapidly expanding province that had very little patience for those who could not keep up. Some came because a doctor signed a form. Some came because a welfare officer signed a form. Some came because a husband or a parent or a local magistrate decided that their presence in the world had become inconvenient. This is not just the story of one asylum. This is the story of what happens when a government decides that science can tell it who deserves to reproduce, and gives one man the power to act on that decision without anyone watching. If you're drawn to the histories that institutions prefer to leave unexamined, you're welcome to subscribe and comment your city and keep exploring with me. To understand what the Brandon Asylum became, you must first understand the world that needed it. In 1870, Manitoba entered Confederation as a province of roughly 12,000 people, most of them Métis, most of them French-speaking, most of them living in a relationship to the land that the Dominion government was already actively working to displace. Within 20 years, that population had been deliberately transformed. The federal government's immigration policy was explicit: fill the prairies with British and continental European settlers, build a wheat economy, connect it by rail, make Canada the breadbasket of the empire. By 1891, when the Brandon Asylum opened, Manitoba's population had surpassed 150,000. Brandon itself had gone from a surveyor's camp to a city of 8,000 in less than a decade. Grain elevators rose along the rail lines. The Canadian Pacific Railway moved wheat east in quantities that made fortunes for men in Winnipeg and Montreal and London. The prairies were being converted, at extraordinary speed, into productive agricultural land. And the people who had lived on that land before the conversion, and the people who could not keep pace with the economic demands of the conversion, were increasingly a problem that the province's new institutions were designed to solve. This is the world that built the Brandon Asylum, a world organized around a very specific idea of who was productive and who was not, who was capable of belonging and who required management. The asylum was the management. But the ideology that opened the Brandon Asylum in 1891 was only the beginning. The science that would come next was considerably worse. The man appointed to give the Brandon Asylum its shape, its philosophy, and its daily character was the province's first medical superintendent. He arrived in 1891 with training in alienism, the forerunner of psychiatry, from institutions in Ontario and Britain. He believed in moral therapy, the idea that mental illness could be treated through the right environment, clean air, productive labor, ordered routine, distance from the chaos that had broken the mind in the first place. He was a man of his era, and his era considered him progressive. He designed the institution's early program. Patients worked. They tended the farm, the vegetable gardens, the dairy. They maintained the building. They attended chapel on Sundays. They ate together in a communal hall at the same times every day. He believed the farm was essential, not as an economic resource, but as a therapeutic one. Purposeful labor, he argued in his early annual reports to the Manitoba government, restored the relationship between mind and body that mental illness had disrupted. He wrote those reports with evident confidence. He used the language of science and progress. He described the asylum as an instrument of healing and the province as a compassionate one for building it. What he did not write about was what happened to those who did not recover. The patients who arrived and did not respond to the farm and the chapel and the ordered routine. The patients who arrived not because they were mentally ill, but because they were poor or disruptive, or indigenous, or simply in someone's way. He filed those patients under the same administrative categories as those who were genuinely ill. He added their names to the rolls. He assigned them beds. He counted them in his reports to the government as patients receiving care. He was never asked to account for the difference. He served his full tenure and retired with the province's thanks. He was the first in a line of men who held absolute authority over hundreds of people who had no mechanism to challenge them, and who used that authority without anyone watching. There is one document from the asylum's earliest years that survives in the provincial archives, and that tells more about the institution than any annual report. It is a note written by a patient, a former schoolteacher, from a farming community south of Brandon. She had been committed by her husband in 1893. Her diagnosis recorded as nervous exhaustion. She wrote the note on the back of a form requisitioned for another purpose, and managed to get it to a visitor who carried it out. She described the view from her ward window, the wheat fields stretching east toward the horizon. She described watching the harvesting in the fall of that year, the machinery moving through fields she could see but not reach. She wrote, "I taught 30 children in this county. I know their names. I do not know why I cannot go home." She did not go home. Her file ends without a discharge record. The province was proud of what it had built. The Brandon Asylum was not built to dazzle. It was built to endure. The original structure, completed in 1891, was 4 stories of Manitoba brick, the deep red of the local clay, quarried and fired into a solidity that was itself a kind of argument. The building said, "We are serious about this. We are here for a long time." The central administration block rose above the wings with an authority that read, from the road, as institutional. The specific Victorian architecture of places designed to reassure a watching public that its problems were being managed by sober, professional men. The entrance hall was wide and clean. The floors were institutional tile, buffed to a shine that visitors noted in their accounts of the place. Journalists who came to write approvingly about Manitoba's modern approach to mental health. Politicians who came to demonstrate their commitment to progressive governance. The hall led back to a superintendent's office with tall windows that looked out over the front grounds. It was the kind of office designed to project authority to those who entered it. The wards extended east and west from the central block, long corridors of rooms that the original plans described as airy and light. The windows were large by institutional standards. Each ward had a common room at its end where patients might spend their non-working hours. The farm occupied the land behind and around the building on 3 sides: vegetable gardens, a dairy, grain fields, a root cellar, a slaughterhouse. The farm was meant to make the institution self-sufficient, growing its own food, heating itself, maintaining its own buildings, all through the ordered labor of the patients who lived inside it. The architects made a point, in their original plans, of the view. The asylum was positioned specifically to give the wards a clear sightline across the Manitoba prairie, the clean, flat horizon that the province's promotional literature described as the promise of limitless possibility. For the people who stood at those ward windows over the following decades, the horizon was not a promise. It was a boundary. There is one detail from the original construction that deserves to be preserved here, because it will mean something different before this story is over. The asylum's farm was designed, from the beginning, as a therapeutic resource. The Manitoba government's approval documents for the project describe the farm in explicitly medical terms. Patient labor in the open air, tending productive land, was to be a cornerstone of the curative program. Work in the moral therapy model was healing. The farm was medicine. They could not know, or perhaps they could, and simply did not say, that within a single generation, the farm would stop being medicine and start being something else entirely. In its first years, the Brandon Asylum functioned approximately as its founders had described. The patient population was small enough in the early 1890s to be managed with something that resembled genuine attention. The superintendent knew his patients by name. He documented their histories, their family circumstances, their responses to the farm and the routine. There were genuine recoveries, people who arrived in acute crisis, and, given structure and distance from whatever had overwhelmed them, improved enough to leave. The superintendent counted these in his annual reports to Winnipeg as evidence that the program was working. The province sent its representatives to visit. There were tours. Journalists wrote approvingly about what they saw. The Brandon Daily Sun ran a piece in 1894 describing the asylum as a credit to Manitoba's humanity and modern scientific understanding. The building was clean, the grounds were productive. The patients who appeared before visitors were calm. In the summer months, those visitors could see patients working in the farm fields behind the main building, moving between rows, tending the kitchen garden, stacking cut wood for the winter. It looked, from a distance, like purposeful activity. It looked like healing. But the world outside the asylum was changing faster than the asylum could accommodate. By 1900, Manitoba's population was approaching 250,000 and rising. The immigration wave the Dominion government had engineered was producing exactly the stresses that mass dislocation always produces: poverty, displacement, the social fracturing that comes when communities are assembled rapidly from incompatible parts. The people who could not navigate those stresses were being sent to Brandon. The people who frightened their neighbors, or exhausted their families, or simply had nowhere else to go. They arrived at the Brandon Asylum with increasing regularity, and they did not always leave. By 1910, the asylum held more than 500 patients. It had been built for 200. The farm could no longer be purely therapeutic. It had to be productive. The patients who worked it were no longer healing through labor. They were working to keep the institution running. There is a difference between those two things, and everyone inside the building understood it. The wheat fields at the horizon were still visible from the ward windows. What they represented had already begun to change. The year 1910 marks a turning point in the Brandon Asylum's history that the annual reports of the era never quite named directly, but that appears clearly in the gap between what those reports claimed and what the building itself had become. By 1910, the patient population had outgrown every physical structure the province had built to contain it. New wards were added, then additions to the wards, then new buildings behind the main block. The hillside to the east of the original structure accumulated institutions the way a body accumulates scar tissue, each one a response to a wound that was never quite healed. The population that filled those wards was no longer primarily people suffering from acute mental illness who might recover and return to their communities. It was increasingly what the era called chronics, patients who had been at Brandon for years, who had lost their connections to the outside world, who had no one advocating for their release. Their families had moved, or stopped visiting, or simply stopped asking. The provincial government looked at this population and saw a financial problem. More patients required more resources. More resources required more justification. More justification required a framework. The framework arrived from Britain and the United States. It was called eugenics. Its argument was elegant and catastrophic. Mental illness, poverty, and social deviance were not products of circumstance. They were products of heredity. The people who displayed these traits had inherited them from parents who had also displayed them. The solution was not treatment. Treatment was, at best, a temporary measure. The solution was prevention. Stop the unfit from reproducing, and, within a generation or two, the problem would eliminate itself. It was taught in universities. It was published in respected journals. It was endorsed by leading psychiatrists in Britain, the United States, and Canada. It explained, to the satisfaction of the men who ran institutions like the Brandon Asylum, why their patients weren't getting better, because they were constitutionally incapable of getting better. It also explained why the province did not need to invest more in their care. And it gave the next superintendent of the Brandon Asylum a scientific language for what he had already decided to do. The 1919 Manitoba government report on the Brandon Asylum described conditions in the patient wards as requiring urgent attention. nothing was urgently attended to. The physical transformation of the Brandon Asylum from a therapeutic institution to a custodial one was not announced. It was not the result of a single decision or a single year. It accumulated gradually and deliberately through the decisions of the men who ran the institution and the governments that funded it. The farm, by the 1920s, was an economic operation that required the labor of several hundred patients to function. Patients who were physically capable of working were assigned to work. The assignment was not optional. The conditions under which they worked were determined by the institution, not by any standard outside it. They received no wages. Some received small privileges, extra food, tobacco, slightly better ward placement. The farm's output contributed directly to the institution's operating budget and, through that budget, to the provincial accounts. The province was aware of this. The annual reports documented it. The government did not object. Inside the wards, the ratio of staff to patients had declined to levels that made individual care mathematically impossible. 1 attendant, 40 patients, a locked door. The routines that remained, meals, chapel, work assignment, no longer served the patient's recovery. They served the institution's operation. People continued to arrive. Some came in genuine crisis and received something that resembled help and went home. Most did not. Most became what the institution's internal language called settled patients, a phrase that meant people who had been there long enough that the institution had stopped thinking about what to do with them. At the center of this transformation, from 1919 onward, was one man. He had arrived with credentials that made questioning him difficult. He had ideas that gave the province's existing practices a scientific foundation. He had the full support of a government that needed someone to manage the problem it had been building for 30 years. Dr. Frederick W. Dupe was appointed medical superintendent of the Brandon Asylum for the Insane in 1919. He had trained in psychiatry in Ontario and had spent several years working in Ontario's psychiatric system before coming west. He was a member of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. He published regularly in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. He presented his findings at national and international conferences. He corresponded with leading psychiatrists in Britain and the United States. He was consulted by the Manitoba government on all significant decisions regarding mental health policy. His annual reports were received as authoritative documents. His judgments about who should be committed, at what classification, and for what duration were treated as final. He was the most trusted psychiatric authority in Western Manitoba for over 30 years. His patients were working 12-hour days in the farm fields without wages. Some of them had been at Brandon for more than a decade, with no documented clinical review. Some of them had been committed as teenagers for reasons that had nothing to do with mental illness. Some of them would be sterilized on his recommendation without their knowledge or consent. Dupe believed, and published his belief, that the distinction between patients who might recover and patients who would not was not a question of treatment. It was a question of heredity. In his framework, the patients who filled Brandon's long-stay wards were there because they were constitutionally incapable of living in the world outside. Their mental deficiency, the era's term, applied broadly enough to cover poverty, indigeneity, sexual nonconformity, and any behavior that a physician found troubling was written into their biology. They had inherited it. They would pass it on. The appropriate institutional response, in Dupe's published view, was not more treatment. It was permanent segregation, combined with what he called reproductive hygiene, the prevention of procreation by those classified as mentally defective. He presented this view at the 1929 Canadian National Conference on Child Welfare. He published it in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 1931. He testified before a Manitoba Legislative Committee in 1933, arguing that the province needed statutory authority to sterilize patients classified as mentally defective without requiring their individual consent. He believed he was a scientist, advancing human welfare. He believed every word of it. What his science demanded, in practice, was that he stop thinking of the people in his institution as people whose futures were open, and start thinking of them as a biological problem his profession was uniquely positioned to solve. The ideology that ran the Brandon Asylum in the 1930s and 1940s did not operate in isolation. It was the same ideology that Alberta had enshrined in law in 1928 with its Sexual Sterilization Act, legislation that authorized the sterilization of those deemed mentally defective without their consent, and that would result in nearly 3,000 forced sterilizations before it was finally repealed in 1972. It was the ideology that had produced compulsory sterilization programs in 29 American states by 1930, and that had been upheld by the United States Supreme Court in 1927 in a decision that described the sterilization of the unfit as a matter of public welfare. In Manitoba, the push for similar legislation was real. Dupe had testified for it. Professional bodies had advocated for it. The provincial government had considered it seriously. The legislation was never passed, not because the government rejected the ideology, but because the political moment for it never quite arrived. What the absence of a formal statute meant, in practice, was not protection. It meant that the decisions about who was sterilized at the Brandon Asylum were made administratively rather than legislatively, made by the superintendent and his staff, documented in files that were not accessible to patients or their families, and executed in the course of medical procedures that patients were told served other purposes. The consent of the patient was not sought. The consent of the patient's family was occasionally sought and occasionally fabricated in the paperwork. The records of these procedures were maintained in files that the provincial government did not review. The patients trusted the institution. Their families trusted the system that told them this was care. They had no framework within which to understand what was happening to their bodies, and no language with which to object. The farm had been part of the Brandon Asylum from the beginning. By the 1930s, it had become something the original architects of moral therapy would not have recognized. Patient labor at the Brandon Asylum by the Depression era was mandatory, unpaid, and uncompensated in any form that a court of law would recognize as consideration for work performed. Patients who were physically capable of working were assigned to work. The farm, the laundry, the kitchen, the building maintenance, all of it was performed by people who had no right to refuse, no recourse if they objected, and no knowledge that the province was recording the value of their labor as a credit to the institution's operating account. The provincial government's own financial records, available in the Manitoba archives, document the contribution of patient labor to the Brandon Asylum's operating budget in terms that make the arrangement's nature clear. Patient labor was an asset. It appeared on one side of a ledger. It reduced the cost of running the institution. The cost on the other side of the ledger did not appear. Patients who refused to work, or who were unable to maintain the pace required, faced consequences that the institution's internal documents recorded under the term management. This term covered a range of responses that included solitary confinement, reduction of rations, restriction to lower grade wards where conditions were measurably worse, and physical discipline that the 1944 inspection report would describe, in the careful language of provincial bureaucracy, as beyond any accepted therapeutic rationale. In no case was a patient who refused work assigned a lawyer. In no case was the refusal treated as a signal that the patient's situation required review. Electroconvulsive therapy arrived at the Brandon Asylum in the early 1940s. In its properly administered form, calibrated carefully, applied to appropriate candidates, monitored for adverse effects, it was a legitimate treatment for some conditions. What was practiced at Brandon during the 1940s and 1950s was documented in survivor testimony and internal records as something different. ECT applied without clinical indication to patients who had not been assessed for its appropriateness, in some cases as a management tool for patients who were disruptive or non-compliant. Survivors described the same experience across decades and across wards, the disorientation that lasted for days, the memory that came back wrong, the sense of having been subtracted from yourself and being uncertain what had been taken. One former patient, interviewed by a Winnipeg journalist in 1983, described it this way: "After the treatments, I didn't know what year it was. I had to be told I had children. I had to be shown a photograph to believe it." Inside the lower wards, by the 1940s, the logic of custody had replaced the logic of treatment so completely that the two were no longer distinguishable. Patients in the long-stay wards did not have treatment plans. They had ward assignments. They had work assignments. They had meal times and chapel attendance, and the twice-yearly visit of a physician who documented their continued presence in the institution and moved on to the next file. Some of those patients had been at Brandon since the 1920s. They knew the farm better than any staff member. They knew which floorboards creaked, which windows caught the morning light, which section of the wheat field was visible from the east-facing ward. They had committed no crime. Many of them had no diagnosable mental illness, by any standard that would survive the scrutiny of a modern clinician. They were simply people who had been classified, in the bureaucratic language of an earlier era, as problems, and who had been placed in a building designed to ensure that problems remained contained. But numbers, even these numbers, can become abstract. Some of these patients had names. Numbers, even horrifying numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember 3 names. Anna was 17 years old in the autumn of 1938 when she was committed to the Brandon Asylum for the Insane. The form that authorized her commitment was signed by a provincial welfare officer in a town 90 kilometers north of Brandon. Her documented diagnosis was moral deficiency. She was Métis. She had given birth to a child the previous spring, outside of marriage. The child was taken from her by welfare authorities. She was transported to Brandon. Before she arrived, Anna had worked as a domestic in 2 households in her home community. She spoke English and Mashif. She sewed. She kept a small journal that her sister described decades later as full of observations about the natural world, the birds she noticed, the weather, the way light moved across the fields in different seasons. She was, her sister said, the person in the family who noticed things. Inside the Brandon Asylum, she was classified as a low-grade patient and assigned to laundry work. She was sterilized in the spring of 1940. The procedure was documented in her file as an appendectomy. She was not told what had been done to her. She asked, over the years that followed, why she was not having her monthly cycle. The file records that she was told this was a common effect of her condition. She remained at Brandon for 14 years. She was released in 1952 with $4 and a one-way bus ticket to a city where she had no connections and no support. She found work as a domestic again. She lived quietly. She never understood what had happened to her body until her daughter, the child taken from her at birth, who had been searching for her for years, found her in 1989. The daughter obtained Anna's file through a provincial Freedom of Information request in 1991. The file contained the sterilization record. Anna was 80 years old by then. She died in 1994. There was no apology. Thomas was 51 years old in 1934 when he was transferred to the Brandon Asylum from the Portage La Prairie jail, where he had been held for 6 weeks on a charge of vagrancy. He was a veteran of the First World War. He had served in France. He had come home in 1919, unable to work, unable to sleep without screaming, unable to maintain the ordinary functions of a civilian life that had gone on without him for 4 years. He had spent the intervening 15 years moving between seasonal labor and vagrancy, working when he could, sleeping rough when he could not, drinking when he could afford to, sobering up in jail cells that were the only institutional response the province had to offer a man who was drowning in something no one had a name for yet. The commitment form noted his military service in passing. It noted his vagrancy charge in detail. His diagnosis was mental deficiency aggravated by alcoholism. His file contained no psychiatric assessment. It contained a record of the jail transfer and a note from the receiving physician at Brandon that described him as agitated but manageable. Thomas worked the Brandon farm for 9 years. He was transferred to the lower ward in 1943 following an incident that the file described only as resistance to routine. He remained in the lower ward until his death in 1949. He was 56 years old. He was buried in the Asylum cemetery. The grave marker was a metal stake with a number. His name appeared in no obituary. There was no death notice sent to any family member. No one was ever asked to account for the 15 years Thomas spent inside a building that had no clinical basis for holding him and no legal mechanism by which he could have made it stop. Irene was 28 years old in 1946 when she committed herself voluntarily to the Brandon Asylum, seeking help for what she described to the admitting physician as persistent sadness and an inability to care for her 3 children the way she believed she should. She had been a school teacher before her marriage. She was a reader. She kept lists of the books she had finished and notes on what she thought about them. She was admitted and assigned to a treatment ward. She received electroconvulsive therapy, 12 treatments over the course of 6 weeks. The clinical notes for each treatment record that she was less agitated following the session. Her own account, given 30 years later in an interview with a Winnipeg journalist, was different. She described coming back to herself after each treatment as though parts of her had been rearranged while she was unconscious, and she could not locate where they had been put. She left the Brandon Asylum after 4 months. She went home to her husband and her 3 children. It took her 2 years before she could read a full book again. The lists she kept from before her admission were still in a drawer. She could not remember what she had thought about the books she had read before. She could not reconstruct the person who had kept those lists. She sought no compensation. She told no one outside her immediate family what had happened to her inside the Brandon Asylum, because in 1946, and for many years after, the experience of having been in a psychiatric institution was itself a source of shame that the institution had deliberately installed in the people it treated. She carried it privately for the rest of her life. She died in 2001. She never received an apology from the province of Manitoba. These 3 stories represent hundreds more. Conservatively, hundreds. Many never came forward. Some were too damaged. Some carried shame. Some died inside Brandon without leaving a record that anyone outside the institution ever found. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their suffering deserves to be acknowledged. The record of what happened at the Brandon Asylum during its worst decades was not accidentally incomplete. It was deliberately contained. In 1944, a provincial government inspector completed a formal review of conditions at the Brandon Asylum and submitted his findings to the Manitoba Department of Health. His report was specific. He documented patients confined to locked wards for periods exceeding 10 years with no current treatment plan and no legal review of their continued commitment. He documented patient farm labor that he described as generating institutional revenue with no compensation provided to the workers. He documented physical discipline by attendants that he described, in the cautious language of a civil servant, writing for his superiors, as beyond any accepted therapeutic rationale. The report was received by the Deputy Minister of Health. It was classified as internal correspondence. It was not released publicly. No patient was informed of its findings. No family received notification. No independent investigation was ordered. What happened instead was a letter to the medical superintendent. Dupe wrote back within 3 weeks. He acknowledged certain deficiencies. He described improvements currently underway. He expressed confidence in the institution's direction. The deputy minister filed the response. The matter was considered addressed. The medical superintendent, who presided over the conditions documented in that report, who had testified before the legislature in support of legislation enabling what that report documented, who had published the ideology that had shaped 3 decades of institutional practice, retired in 1951 with a formal commendation from the province of Manitoba for his service to the mental health of its citizens. He was never investigated. He was never charged. His name appeared in the Winnipeg Free Press Death Notice in 1958 as a distinguished figure in Canadian medicine. Not one person under his authority during those years was ever prosecuted for what the 1944 inspection report had documented in writing. The first sustained public examination of what had happened at the Brandon Asylum did not come from inside the institution. It did not come from the Manitoba government. It came from survivors, from family members, and from the slow accumulation of testimony given by people who had stopped waiting for the province to ask. By the 1970s and 1980s, some former patients had begun to speak. A handful did so publicly, to journalists, to researchers, to advocates who were beginning to build the legal and political framework for what would eventually become a broader reckoning with the history of Canadian psychiatric institutions. What they described, across different wards, different decades, different experiences, was consistent in its essential shape. They described an institution that had processed them not as patients to be treated, but as problems to be managed. They described the labor. They described the treatments. They described the locked wards. They described the years without any contact from anyone who asked what they needed, rather than what the institution required of them. In 1992, the Manitoba government commissioned a review of the province's psychiatric facilities' historical practices. The review produced a report documenting patterns of wrongful commitment, patient labor exploitation, and treatment practices inconsistent with the medical standards of their own era. The report was received and filed. Some recommendations were implemented, some were not. A small number of former patients received acknowledgement letters. The letters did not include the word apology. They included expressions of regret and commitments to ongoing improvement. The sterilization program that operated at the Brandon Asylum without legislative authority and without patient consent has never been the subject of a formal public inquiry in Manitoba. The number of patients sterilized at Brandon without their knowledge or consent remains unknown because the relevant files are incomplete, inconsistently kept, and in some cases sealed under privacy legislation that was designed to protect individuals, but functions in practice to protect the institution. The survivors who were still alive in the 1990s were not offered compensation programs. They were offered review processes. The difference between those two things was the difference between being told your suffering is acknowledged and being told it is still being evaluated. The Brandon Asylum was not an anomaly. It was an expression of a consensus that extended from the institutional level to the legislative level to the national level. The eugenicist ideology that shaped the Brandon Asylum's practices in the 1920s through the 1950s was the same ideology that produced Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928, legislation under which nearly 3,000 people were forcibly sterilized before it was repealed in 1972. It was the same ideology that shaped British Columbia's sterilization program. It was taught in medical schools. It appeared in the curricula of nursing programs. It was endorsed by the Canadian Medical Association and cited in federal public health documents. Leilani Muir was admitted to the provincial training school in Red Deer, Alberta in 1955. She was 11 years old. She was classified as a mental defective on the basis of an IQ test administered while she was malnourished and grieving. She was sterilized without her knowledge in 1959. She was 16 years old. In 1996, an Alberta court found that the province had wronged her and awarded her compensation. She became the face of a movement that resulted in more than 800 Albertans filing claims against the provincial government for wrongful sterilization. Manitoba had no equivalent public legal process. The Huronia Regional Centre in Ontario held over 2,000 people classified as mentally retarded, many of them individuals whose disabilities, with appropriate community support, would never have prevented them from living in their communities. A class action lawsuit launched in 2009 resulted in an Ontario court finding that the province had breached its duty of care. The government apologized in 2013. Manitoba had no equivalent apology. The residential school system that ran parallel to the asylum system, that took Indigenous children from their families and communities, that suppressed their languages and their cultures, that produced rates of trauma and abuse that are still being counted, intersected directly with the asylum system at the Brandon Asylum. Indigenous patients arrived at Brandon through pathways that ran through Indian affairs and welfare systems. They were committed through processes that provided no meaningful consent. They received no advocacy. Their files do not consistently document the circumstances of their admission or the basis for their continued commitment. That intersection, the residential school system and the asylum system, operating simultaneously on the same communities, in the same province, funded by the same governments, has never been the subject of a formal joint inquiry. The Brandon Mental Health Center, which is what the Brandon Asylum became after successive name changes that tracked the province's desire to put distance between itself and what the institution had been, closed its inpatient units in the early 2000s as part of Manitoba's shift toward community-based mental health care. The main building still stands at the edge of Brandon. It still stands in red Manitoba brick. The windows are still tall and narrow. The roofline still rises above the flat land around it, with the settled authority of something that has been there a very long time. The wheat fields to the east are still there. They still go to the horizon. The building is currently used in part as administrative office space for provincial health services. Some sections stand empty. The grounds that once held the farm are partly developed, partly returned to grass. There is no plaque on the building that names what happened inside it. There is no memorial on the grounds. The patient cemetery that existed on the asylum property, the ground where patients who died inside Brandon were buried, some with markers and some without. The ground where Thomas's numbered metal stake once stood is no longer clearly delineated. Development has encroached. Some graves were relocated, some were not. The records of who was buried where are incomplete. No public memorial lists the names of those buried there. The building still stands. The wheat still grows. And the province of Manitoba has never commissioned a full independent inquiry into what happened at the Brandon Asylum. How many people were harmed? Or what became of the records that would tell us? There are two Brandon Asylums. The first was built with genuine intention. The reformers who argued for it, the politicians who funded it, the physicians who designed its early program, they believed they were building something better than the jails and poorhouses that had preceded it. The first Brandon Asylum was imperfect and underfunded and shaped by the prejudices of its era. But it was, in its origin, an attempt to provide a humane response to human suffering. The second Brandon Asylum was the institution that emerged in the 1920s and operated through the mid-20th century, shaped not by the humanitarian impulse of moral therapy, but by the pseudo-scientific certainty of eugenics. It was an institution that classified the poor, the indigenous, the sexually non-conforming, and the simply inconvenient as biologically defective, that sterilized them without their knowledge, that worked them without wages, that held them without review, that protected the men who did all of this with commendations and pensions and the formal thanks of a provincial government that preferred not to look too directly at what it was funding. The worst the first Brandon Asylum did was fail to heal people who needed healing. The worst the second did was take people who had nothing wrong with them that the world outside could not have accommodated, and use science as a warrant for doing things to them that the science, even by the standards of its own era, did not justify. Both buildings had the same address. Both had the same wheat fields at the horizon. Both were called care. The unanswered questions remain. How many people were sterilized at the Brandon Asylum without their knowledge or consent? The number is unknown. The relevant records are incomplete. The province has never commissioned the independent review that would establish it. How many of the people buried in the asylum cemetery were committed for reasons that no clinical standard would have supported? No one has counted. How many Indigenous patients arrived at the Brandon Asylum through Indian Affairs and welfare channels that bypassed any meaningful consent? And what happened to them inside? The intersection of the colonial system and the asylum system at Moose. Brandon remains largely unexamined. What did it cost, in lives and in years, and in the specific irreversible damage done to specific bodies, to run the Brandon Asylum on the ideology of eugenics for 30 years? That accounting has not been done. Will it be? The wheat still grows at the horizon. The building still stands in Manitoba brick. From certain windows on the upper floors, if you look east on a clear morning, the prairie still goes as far as you can see. Flat, open, the kind of landscape that was sold to settlers as limitless possibility. For the people who stood at those windows over the course of a century, the horizon was not a promise. It was where the world they had been removed from continued to exist without them. The building is still there. The files are still incomplete. And somewhere in the provincial archives, in folders that carry the names of people who were never asked to consent to what was done to them, the evidence of what Manitoba chose to believe about who deserved to belong to it is still waiting to be fully read. Who is going to read it?